The great hall stretched for what seemed like forever. Crystals of every color hung from the ceiling, each one worth more than an entire human city. Light from a dying star poured through windows made of solidified time itself. This was the Hall of the Concord, the place where the rulers of 10,000 worlds gathered to decide the fate of species. Ambassador Alara Vance walked alone across the polished floor. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. She was 43 years old, with gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She wore a simple black suit, nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Compared to the beings that surrounded her, she looked like a child who had wandered into a meeting of gods. And in many ways, she was. The Council of 12 sat on thrones arranged in a half circle. Each throne was designed for a different body type, because the rulers of the galaxy came in many shapes. The Valeth Empress glowed with soft blue light, her body made of flowing tendrils that never stopped moving. The Crethful High Arbiter was a mountain of living stone, ancient beyond measure, his eyes burning like coals in a face that had watched stars die. The Sonari Observer floated in a tank of green liquid, their form constantly shifting between shapes that human eyes could not fully understand. These beings had ruled the galaxy for 6,000 years. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had crushed rebellions, absorbed civilizations, and shaped the destiny of trillions of lives. To them, humanity was nothing. A young species. A small species. Barely worth noticing. Alara stopped in the center of the hall and waited. The Valeth Empress spoke first. Her voice was like music and poison mixed together. "You are the representative of the human species?" "I am Ambassador Alara Vance of the United Earth Government," Alara replied. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this moment for years. "We have reviewed your petition," the Empress continued. "Your species wishes to join the Galactic Concord as a protectorate member. This is wise. The galaxy is dangerous for young species who stand alone." Alara said nothing. She simply listened. The Crethful High Arbiter leaned forward. When he moved, it sounded like mountains grinding together. "The terms of protectorate status are standard. They have not changed in 3,000 years. You will reduce your military to defensive levels only. You will accept population guidance to ensure sustainable growth. Certain of your colony worlds will be redistributed to species with greater historical claims. In exchange, the Concord will protect you from external threats. You will also pay tribute," the Empress added. 30% of your gross planetary product paid annually. This funds the fleets that keep the peace." Alara listened to all of it. The terms were exactly what she had expected. She had read the treaties signed by other species. She knew what protectorate status really meant. It meant giving up your future. It meant becoming a servant with a fancy title. It meant slowly dying as a people while the elder races took everything that made you special. Every species that had stood in this hall for the past 3,000 years had accepted these terms. Some had argued. Some had begged for better conditions. But in the end, they all said yes. Because the alternative was destruction. The Concord had enough ships to burn entire star systems. They had done it before, to species who had refused. The Empress finished reading the terms and looked at Alara with something like boredom. "Do you have any questions before you sign?" Alara smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible. "I have a statement, not a question. Proceed." "On behalf of the United Earth Government and all human colonies, I must respectfully decline your offer of protectorate status." The silence that followed was absolute. For a long moment, nothing moved. The crystals stopped their gentle swaying. The light itself seemed to freeze. The Crethful High Arbiter was the first to react. His burning eyes flared brighter. "You misunderstand, Ambassador. This is not an offer. This is the way things are done. Every species accepts protectorate status. Those who refuse are designated as threats to galactic peace and dealt with accordingly. I understand perfectly, Ilara said. Her voice remained calm. Humanity declines. The Empress's tendrils went dark and flashed with angry red light. You speak for your entire species? You would doom billions of your people based on your own pride. I speak for humanity, Ilara confirmed. And this is not pride, Empress. This is simply truth. We will not sign away our freedom. We will not surrender our colonies. We will not reduce our fleet. We will not pay tribute to those who have done nothing to earn it. Then you choose war, the Arbiter said. You understand this? Your species is 300 years old. Your fleet numbers perhaps 10,000 ships. We can field 1,000,000. This is not a battle you can win. Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device. She pressed a button and a holographic display appeared in the air around her. Star maps filled the hall, showing not human space, but the secret places of the Concord. Supply routes, communication relays, fuel depots, choke points where trade flowed like blood through arteries. You are correct that we cannot win a straight battle, Ilara said. We never intended to fight one. For 200 years, while your spies watched our public fleet exercises and laughed at our primitive ships, we have been watching you. We have mapped every weakness in your empire. We have positioned assets in places you forgot existed. We have made friends with species you thought were completely under your control. She turned slowly, looking at each member of the council in turn. If you attack us, you will probably win eventually. You have more ships, more resources, more everything. But the cost will be higher than anything you have ever paid. We will make you bleed from 1,000 wounds. We will turn your own systems against you. And while you are focused on crushing us, every other species you have subjugated will be watching. They will see that the Concord can be hurt. They will remember what it felt like to be free. The Sonari observer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Their voice came from everywhere and nowhere. You would sacrifice your entire species to make a point. Ilara's smile grew slightly wider. We are human. We have been making points like this since we first climbed down from the trees. We overthrew kings who had ruled for centuries. We fought wars against empires that covered continents. We walked on our moon because someone said it could not be done. Sacrifice for principle is not a threat to us, observer. It is who we are. She turned back to the Empress. You can have your peace, Empress. All you have to do is leave us alone. Recognize humanity as an independent species. Ask nothing of us that you would not ask of yourselves. Do this, and there will be no war. And if we refuse... Ilara deactivated the holographic display and straightened her simple black suit. Then the age of your peace is over. And what comes next will be decided not by your wishes, but by ours. She turned and began walking back across the crystal floor. Her footsteps echoed in the silence once more. Behind her, she could feel the shock and fury of beings who had not been challenged in 3,000 years. Humanity had spoken. The galaxy would never be the same. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Within hours, every species with access to the galactic communication network knew what had happened. A human had stood before the Council of 12 and said no. A young species, barely out of their cradle, had refused the most powerful beings in existence. Most thought it was madness. The Concord had ruled for 6,000 years. Species who defied them became warnings. Their worlds turned to ash, their names erased from history. Surely the humans would apologize. Surely they would come back to the negotiating table. No species was stupid enough to actually fight the Concord. But the humans did not apologize. In the days following the summit, Ambassador Alara Vance became the most famous human in the galaxy. Her face appeared on news feeds across 10,000 worlds. Some called her brave. Others called her insane. The Concord officially labeled her a war criminal and placed a bounty on her head, large enough to buy a small planet. Alara did not hide. She returned to Earth and addressed the United Parliament in Geneva. The session was broadcast live to every human colony. "I know many of you are afraid," she told them. "You have every right to be. The Concord has more ships than we can count. They have weapons that can crack planets. They have been fighting wars since before our ancestors discovered fire. By any reasonable measure, we should accept their terms and hope for mercy." She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives of humanity. "But we are not a reasonable species. We have never been reasonable. We spread across our world not because it was easy, but because something inside us refused to stay still. We built cities in deserts. We crossed oceans in boats made of wood. We split the atom and walked among the stars. Every step of our journey was called impossible by someone. And every time, we proved them wrong." The Parliament chamber was completely silent. "The Concord does not understand us," Alara continued. "They see our numbers and calculate our strength. They measure our ships and count our soldiers. And they conclude that we are weak. But they are measuring the wrong things. Our strength is not in our fleet. Our strength is in what we are willing to do when someone threatens our freedom. They think they know what war looks like. They have no idea what humanity looks like when we decide that losing is not an option." 3 days later, the Concord made their first move. A fleet of 500 ships appeared at the edge of human space, near a small colony called New Brisbane. The colony had 80,000 people, mostly farmers and miners. They had no military value, but that was the point. The Concord wanted to show humanity what happened to those who defied them. The fleet commander was a Valith admiral named Sixrath. She had crushed rebellions on 17 worlds. She expected this to be simple. Move in, destroy the colony, leave before any human ships could respond. A message written in blood and fire. What she found instead was a surprise. New Brisbane should have been undefended. According to Concord intelligence, the nearest human military base was 3 days away at maximum speed. But when Sixrath's fleet arrived, they found 200 ships waiting for them. These were not military vessels. They were cargo haulers, mining ships, passenger transports. Ships that had no business being in a battle. Every single one of them was armed. The colonists of New Brisbane had spent the last 3 days welding weapons onto anything that could fly. They had stripped their mining equipment for parts. They had emptied their warehouses of explosives. They had turned their peaceful civilian fleet into a desperate defense force. Sixrath hesitated. This was not how other species behaved. When faced with overwhelming force, rational beings retreated. They surrendered. They begged for terms. They did not strap bombs to their cargo ships and fly toward a fleet that outnumbered them 2 to 1. While she hesitated, a message arrived from the lead human ship. It was not a plea for mercy. It was not even a formal military communication. It was the voice of a 53-year-old grandmother named Maria Chun, who had spent her life hauling ore from asteroid mines. "This is New Brisbane Defense Fleet to Concord vessels. You are not welcome here. Turn around and leave, or we will make you regret ever learning our name." Sixrath was insulted. She was one of the greatest admirals in the Concord Navy. She had been threatened by kings and emperors. She would not be intimidated by farmers. She ordered her fleet to attack. The battle lasted 6 hours. The humans lost 147 ships. 12,000 people died, including Maria Chun, whose vessel rammed a Concord cruiser at full speed. But they did not run. They did not surrender. They fought until their weapons were empty. Then they rammed their ships into enemy vessels. They turned their own bodies into weapons. When it was over, Sixroth had lost 212 ships, nearly half her fleet. The colony of New Brisbane still stood. The admiral retreated to regroup. She sent a report to the council, explaining what had happened. The response she received was not what she expected. The council was not pleased with her failure, but they were even more disturbed by something else. The humans had known she was coming. They had known exactly when and where her fleet would arrive. They had been waiting for her. This meant one of two things. Either human intelligence capabilities were far better than anyone had assumed, or the Concorde had traitors in its ranks. Both possibilities were terrifying on Earth. The news of New Brisbane spread quickly. 12,000 dead was a terrible price. But humanity had proven something important. They could fight the Concorde and survive. They could hurt the ancient empire. They could make the cost of conquest so high that even the most powerful beings in the galaxy would have to think twice. Recruitment. Centers across human space were overwhelmed with volunteers. Factories that had been making consumer goods switched to producing weapons. Scientists who had been working on peaceful research turned their minds to war. Humanity was not just ready to fight. Humanity was eager, and across the galaxy, other species were watching. Species who had accepted protectorate status because they thought they had no choice. Species whose ancestors had been free before the Concorde crushed them. Species who had forgotten what resistance looked like. They remembered now in the shadows of the great empires. Whispers began to spread. If the humans could do it, maybe others could too. Maybe the Concorde was not as invincible as they claimed. Maybe the Age of Peace was nothing more than the Age of Fear, and maybe fear could be conquered. The Concorde had ruled through the belief that resistance was impossible. At New Brisbane, a grandmother and her farmers had proven that belief wrong. The galaxy was beginning to wake up. Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of the Unconquered and stared at the display screen surrounding him. Each screen showed the same thing: ships. Thousands upon thousands of ships, pouring through the terminus gate like water through a broken dam. The Concorde had sent everything they had. The official count was 8,000 vessels. The real number was probably higher. Among them were ships that had never been seen outside of ancient historical records. Planet crackers, star killers, weapons that could end worlds with a single shot. The Concorde was done playing games. They meant to wipe humanity from existence. Chen Wei was 61 years old. He had been a soldier for most of his life, fighting in the small border conflicts that humans had among themselves before first contact. Those wars seemed like children's games now. He had 3,000 ships under his command. His enemy had almost 3 times that number. "Sir," his tactical officer said, her voice tight with fear she was trying to hide. "The gate is still open. They are still coming through. Let them come," Chen Wei replied. His voice was calm. "They are right where we want them." The Terminus Gate was the primary route into human space from the Concorde core worlds. It was a natural choke point, a place where the strange geometry of faster-than-light travel forced ships to emerge in a specific location. For 6 months, humanity had been preparing this battlefield. For 6 months, they had hidden their preparations from Concorde spies. The plan was simple. It was also insane. 3 hours earlier, before the Concorde fleet arrived, human engineering vessels had planted charges throughout the gate structure. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to collapse it temporarily. Once the Concorde fleet was through, they would detonate the charges. The enemy would be trapped in human space with no easy way home. Of course, this meant that humanity would also be trapped with 8,000 enemy warships. But that was part of the plan. "All charges are ready, Admiral," his communications officer reported. Engineering teams have cleared the blast zone. Wait until 60% of their fleet is through, Chanwei ordered. Then blow it. The minutes passed slowly. On the screens, more and more Concorde ships emerged from the gate. They were forming into attack formations, preparing to sweep through human space like a burning wave. Their commanders were confident. They had won battles like this 1,000 times before. 60%, Admiral. Detonate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the terminus gate twisted in on itself. The carefully balanced energies that kept it stable suddenly disrupted. The ships still inside the gate were torn apart instantly. The ships that had already emerged found themselves cut off from reinforcement. Now the real battle began. The Concorde fleet outnumbered Chen Wei's forces heavily. In a straight fight, they would win easily. But humanity had never planned for a straight fight. Hidden among the asteroids and debris of the battlefield were thousands of smaller vessels. Mining ships with their drills replaced by weapons. Cargo haulers loaded with explosives. Shuttles piloted by volunteers who had no intention of coming home. The Concorde admirals had studied human military tactics. They had prepared for fleet formations and standard engagement patterns. They had not prepared for chaos. Human ships attacked from every direction at once. They ignored traditional military targets and went after support vessels, fuel tankers, communication relays. They rammed their ships into enemy hulls and detonated their power cores. They turned their own deaths into weapons. Commander Talia Okonkwo was 29 years old. She piloted a converted mining vessel with a crew of 12. Her ship had no shields, minimal armor, and weapons that were held together with emergency welding. When a Concorde cruiser locked onto her vessel, she did not try to run. "All hands, brace for impact," she announced calmly. "It has been an honor serving with you." She aimed her ship at the cruiser's engine section and accelerated to maximum speed. The impact destroyed both vessels. The cruiser had carried 3,000 crew members and enough firepower to destroy a small moon. Stories like this repeated across the battlefield. Human pilots, knowing they could not win, chose to take their enemies with them. Human engineers overloaded their own reactors to create explosions that damaged nearby enemy ships. Human soldiers in boarding pods breached Concorde vessels and fought to the last breath. The elder races of the galaxy did not fight like this. They were rational. They calculated odds and retreated when those odds turned against them. They valued their own lives above victory. A Concorde admiral, faced with the same situation, would have surrendered. A Concorde crew would have abandoned ship. Humans did not surrender. Humans did not abandon ship. Humans died with their hands on their weapons and curses on their lips. The Battle of Terminus Gate lasted 9 hours. When it was over, the Concorde had lost 4,000 ships, more than half their fleet. Humanity had lost nearly everything. Of Chen Wei's 3,000 military vessels, only 600 remained operational. Of the civilian volunteers who had joined the battle, perhaps 1 in 10 survived. 12,000 humans died that day. 12,000 people who had known they probably would not survive. 12,000 people who had fought anyway. But humanity had won. The remaining Concorde ships retreated through emergency jump points, fleeing back to the core worlds with news of the disaster. They had come to destroy humanity. Instead, they had learned a terrible lesson. Humans were not like other species. They did not fight to win. They fought to make you lose. They would burn their own worlds before letting you take them. They would sacrifice everything, absolutely everything, rather than accept defeat. Admiral Chen Wei survived the battle. He stood on the bridge of the damaged Unconquered and looked at the wreckage floating in space around him. Thousands of ships, human and alien alike, drifted silently among the stars. It was the largest battle in galactic history, and humanity had won it with desperate courage and a willingness to die. Thought about the people. who had given their lives. The miners and farmers and engineers who had strapped weapons to their civilian ships. The young pilots who had rammed their vessels into enemy hulls. The soldiers who had boarded enemy ships, knowing they would never come back. "Send a message to Earth," he said quietly. "Tell them that the gate is closed. Tell them that we held. And tell them," he paused, his voice breaking slightly, "tell them that we did not forget a single name." On Earth, the news arrived like a thunderbolt. Humanity had won their first real battle against the Concorde. The cost had been terrible, but they had won. They had proven that they could stand against the ancient empire and survive in cities across human space. People gathered in the streets. Some wept for the dead. Some cheered for the victory. Many did both at the same time and in the capitals of the Concorde. The rulers who had ruled for 6,000 years felt something they had not felt in a very long time. They felt afraid. The Council of 12 met in emergency session. The crystal hall that had witnessed 6,000 years of confident rule now felt different. The lights seemed dimmer. The thrones seemed smaller. The rulers who sat upon them seemed, for the first time, uncertain. Half of their greatest fleet had been destroyed at Terminus Gate. 4,000 ships, crewed by beings from a dozen species, were now nothing but wreckage floating in human space. The gate itself was collapsed, cutting off the fastest route to the enemy. And worst of all, the galaxy was watching. The Veileth Empress spoke first. Her tendrils, which once had glowed with calm blue light, now flickered with angry reds and oranges. "This cannot stand. We must assemble a new fleet. A larger fleet. We must crush these humans and make an example of them that will be remembered for 10,000 years. "And where will this fleet come from?" the Crethful High Arbiter asked. His voice ground like stones breaking. "We sent our best ships to Terminus. We cannot replace them quickly. Building new vessels will take years. Years during which the humans will be preparing, growing stronger, spreading their rebellion. Then we take ships from our Protectorate members," the Empress replied. "They owe us tribute. They owe us soldiers. We will call in those debts." The Sonari observer floated silently in their tank, their form shifting between shapes. When they finally spoke, their voice was soft but carried to every corner of the hall. "That may not be as simple as you hope, Empress. We have received concerning reports from several Protectorate systems. The Deshan Combine has begun recalling their ships from Concorde service, claiming they need them for local defense. The Rix Collective has delayed their tribute payments. The Vorn Hegemony has requested a meeting to discuss the terms of their membership. They would not dare defy us," the Empress said. But there was doubt in her voice now. "They already are defying us," the observer replied. "Not openly? Not yet. But they are watching what happens with the humans. They are measuring our response. And if they decide that we are weak..." The thought hung in the air, unfinished but understood by all. The Concorde had ruled through strength. Not just military strength, though that was part of it. They had ruled through the belief that resistance was pointless. For 6,000 years, every species that had challenged them had been crushed. The pattern was so consistent that most species had stopped even thinking about rebellion. It was simply not something that happened. But the humans had changed that. At New Brisbane, a handful of farmers had fought off a Concorde fleet. At Terminus Gate, a smaller human force had destroyed half of the largest armada in galactic history. The pattern was broken. The impossible had become possible. "We need time," the Arbiter said slowly. "Time to rebuild. Time to restore confidence among our members. Perhaps we should consider negotiating with the humans." "Negotiate?" The Empress's tendrils flared bright red. "You would have us surrender to these primitives. You would have us admit that we cannot defeat them?" "I would have us survive," the Arbiter replied. I have lived for 12,000 years, Empress. I have seen empires rise and fall. The strongest empires are those that know when to bend and when to break. If we throw everything we have against the humans and fail again, we will not survive. The protectorates will abandon us. Our enemies will sense weakness. The Concord itself will collapse. The debate continued for hours. The council was divided in ways it had not been for millennia. Some wanted total war, regardless of the cost. Others wanted caution, compromise, survival. A few privately wondered if the Concord's time had simply come to an end. While they argued, the galaxy continued to change. On the planet Desha, the leaders of the Combine held their own secret meeting. 800 years ago, their ancestors had been forced to accept protectorate status after a brief and brutal war. They had been loyal subjects ever since, sending their ships and soldiers to serve Concord interests across the galaxy. But they had never forgotten what freedom felt like. "The humans have shown us something important," their prime speaker said. "The Concord is not invincible. They can be hurt. They can be beaten. If we stand with them now, while they are strong and the Concord is weak, we may have a chance to reclaim what was taken from our ancestors." Similar conversations were happening on 100 other worlds. Species who had accepted subjugation because they thought they had no choice began to wonder if perhaps they did have a choice after all. The memory of freedom long buried began to stir. On Earth, Ambassador Alar Vance understood what was happening. She had hoped for this outcome, but she had not been certain it would actually occur. The Concord's power had always rested on more than just military force. It had rested on belief. The belief that they were unstoppable. The belief that opposing them was suicide. Once that belief was broken, everything else would follow. She began reaching out to the protectorate species. Not with demands or threats, but with offers. Humanity did not want to rule the galaxy. They simply wanted to be free. And they were willing to help others who wanted the same thing. The response was careful at first. Species who had survived under the Concord for centuries knew better than to act rashly. But slowly, secret communications began to flow. Plans were made. Alliances were formed. A new coalition began to take shape, hidden from Concord eyes. 3 months after Terminus Gate, the Deshan Combine announced that they were withdrawing from the Concord. Their prime speaker gave a speech that was broadcast across the galaxy. "For 800 years, we have served masters who did not deserve our loyalty. We have paid tribute to those who gave us nothing in return. We have sent our children to die in wars that were not ours. Today, that ends. The Deshan Combine declares itself a free and independent nation. We stand with humanity and with all species who choose liberty over subjugation." Within a week, 6 more species had made similar declarations. The Concord, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, was falling apart. The Empress demanded military action against the rebels. But the Concord's forces were still recovering from Terminus Gate. They did not have enough ships to fight everyone at once. And each day that passed without punishment made other species bolder. The Sonari observer watched it all with ancient eyes. They had been archivists for longer than most species had existed. They had seen this pattern before, in the ruins of civilizations that predated the Concord itself. Empires that relied on fear always fell eventually. They could maintain control for centuries, even millennia. But sooner or later, someone would stand up. Someone would prove that the fear was hollow. And then the whole structure would come crashing down. The humans had not just won a battle at Terminus Gate. They had killed an idea. The idea that the Concord could not be beaten. And without that idea, the Concord was just a collection of old rulers sitting on old thrones, pretending they still had power. The age of peace was indeed over. Not because of war, but because the peace had never been real. It had been submission dressed in pretty words. And submission, unlike true peace, could not last forever. The galaxy was waking up. And it had humanity to thank for the alarm. 18 months had passed since Ambassador Alara Vance had stood in the Crystal Hall and said no. The galaxy that existed now would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had lived in the old order. The Concord still existed, but it was a shadow of what it had been. Half of its member species had left. Its great fleets had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The rulers who had commanded 10,000 worlds now struggled to maintain control over a few hundred. The Valith, Empress, had been removed from power by her own people. The endless war she had demanded had cost too many lives and achieved nothing. Her replacement was younger, more cautious, and far more willing to accept a new reality. The Krethval had fractured into 3 separate factions, each blaming the others for the disaster. Only the Sonari Observer remained unchanged, watching and recording as they always had done in place of the Concord's absolute rule. Something new had emerged. They called it the Free Systems Alliance, and it had been born in the fires of resistance. 19 species had signed the founding charter, with humanity among the first. More were joining every month. The alliance was different from the Concord in almost every way. There was no tribute. There were no protectorates. Each species governed themselves as they saw fit. The only requirement for membership was a commitment to mutual defense and a promise never to conquer or subjugate another member. It was not perfect. Nothing ever was. Species that had been enemies for centuries had to learn to work together. Old hatreds had to be set aside. Old wounds had to heal. There were arguments and disagreements and moments when the whole thing seemed ready to fall apart, but it held together, because the alternative was going back to the way things had been. And no one wanted that. Alara Vance stood once again in the Crystal Hall. The lights were dimmer now, some of the crystals having been sold off to pay for the Concord's debts. The thrones were mostly empty. Only 3 members of the original council remained. The new Valith representative, a young male named Kyrvith, looked at her with eyes that held none of his predecessor's arrogance. "You asked for this meeting, Ambassador. What does humanity want?" Alara considered the question. She was 45. Now, with more gray in her hair and deeper lines around her eyes. She had seen things in the past 18 months that would stay with her forever. She had watched friends die. She had ordered attacks that killed thousands. She had done terrible things in the name of freedom, but she had also seen something beautiful. She had seen species who had forgotten how to hope begin to dream again. She had seen former enemies shake hands and promise to build something better. She had seen the beginning of a new age. "Humanity wants peace," she said finally. "Real peace. Not the kind you had before, where you called it peace but meant submission. We want a galaxy where every species has the right to determine their own future, where strength is used to protect, not to dominate, where the powerful help the weak instead of exploiting them." Kyrvith was silent for a long moment. "That is, ambitious. Some would say impossible. Species are competitive by nature. The strong will always try to control the weak." "Perhaps," Alara admitted, "but we have to try anyway. We have to believe that we can be better than our nature, because the alternative is to keep doing what we have always done, and that has brought us nothing but suffering." The Krethval representative, one of the few who had argued for caution during the war, spoke up. His voice was quieter than the High Arbiter's had been, less certain of its own power. "And what of those who refuse this peace? What of those who still believe in conquest and domination?" Alara's expression hardened slightly. "Then we will stop them. Not to dominate them, but to protect those they would harm. The Free Systems Alliance does not conquer, but we do defend. And we have proven that we are very good at defense." No one in the room had forgotten Terminus Gate. No one had forgotten the humans who had turned their own ships into weapons rather than surrender. The Concord had learned the hard way that there were some species you did not want as enemies. "We are offering you a choice," Alara continued. "The Concord can continue as it is, shrinking and weakening until it disappears entirely. Or you can accept the new reality. Join the Alliance as equals, not as rulers. Help us build something that might actually last." The Sonari observer spoke for the first time. "You ask us to give up 6,000 years of tradition, to admit that everything we built was wrong. I ask you to evolve," Alara replied, "as all species must eventually do. The universe does not care about tradition. It only cares about survival. And the Concord's way of doing things no longer leads to survival." The meeting ended without a decision. It would take months more of negotiation before the remaining Concord members agreed to join the Alliance. Some never would, but the direction was clear. The old order was dying, and something new was being born. 6 months later, a ceremony was held at Terminus Gate. The gate itself had been repaired, reopened to traffic, but now it served a different purpose. Instead of being a choke point controlled by the Concord, it was a free passage, open to all. A memorial had been built near the gate. It was a simple structure, a ring of stone floating in space, engraved with names. 12,000 names, one for each human who had died in the battle. Around the ring, smaller monuments honored the soldiers from other species who had fallen in the war that followed. Alara stood before the memorial, surrounded by representatives from dozens of worlds. Cameras broadcast the moment across the galaxy. "We stand here today to remember those who gave everything for our freedom," she said. "They were not warriors by training. They were farmers and miners and engineers. They were parents and children and friends. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because they believed that some causes are worth dying for." She paused, looking at the names carved in stone. "The galaxy they dreamed of is not yet built. It may never be finished. Freedom is not a destination but a journey, and that journey has no end. But because of what they did, because of the price they paid, we have the chance to walk that path. We have the chance to build something better than what came before." She turned to face the gathered representatives. "Let us not waste that chance. Let us remember that the peace we enjoy was purchased with sacrifice. And let us honor that sacrifice by being worthy of it, by treating each other with respect, by helping those who cannot help themselves, by remembering that every species, no matter how young or small or different, has the same right to exist and to thrive." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. Across the galaxy, billions of beings from hundreds of species paused to honor the fallen. It was the first truly galactic moment of unity in history. Not unity imposed by force, but unity chosen freely. Later, when the cameras were off and the representatives had returned to their ships, Alara stood alone before the memorial. She reached out and touched one of the names carved into the stone. Maria Chun, the grandmother who had rammed her mining ship into a Concord cruiser. "We did it," Alara whispered. "I hope it was worth it." There was no answer except the silence of space. But somewhere in that silence, Alara thought she could feel the presence of all those who had died. All those who had fought and sacrificed and believed. All those who had looked at an impossible enemy and decided to fight anyway. Humanity had changed the galaxy. Not through being stronger or smarter or more advanced, but through being stubborn, through refusing to accept that things could not change, through believing that freedom was worth any price. It was perhaps the most human thing they could have done. And the galaxy, finally, understood what that meant.